Some bridges must be burned to see the shore. This is not about passion, but about the inevitable collision of two worlds, where only what is real survives. Everything else turns to ash. The Ministry of Magic atrium had been transformed into a suffocating cage of gold leaf and velvet. Above, the enchanted ceiling mimicked a clear, star-dusted night. A cruel lie, considering the torrential London downpour hammering against the invisible barriers of the visitor's entrance. The air inside smelled of expensive perfume, ozone, and the distinct, cloying scent of forced celebration. Draco Malfoy stood in the shadow of the Fountain of Magical Brethren, a glass of fire whiskey resting untouched in his pale hand. He wore black, an impeccably tailored set of dress robes that cost more than the annual budget of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. He was a statue of aristocrat indifference, a sharp, colourless contrast to the riot of colour swirling around him. He was watching her. He was always watching her. It was a habit he had categorized as professional surveillance, a necessary evil of working on the same floor. But tonight, the lies he told himself were thinner than usual. Hermione Granger stood near the center of the room, bathed in the soft, floating light of hovering candles. She was wearing deep emerald green, a shade that made her skin look like porcelain and her unruly curls tame by comparison. She was smiling. It was the practiced, weary smile of a war heroine who knew she was public property. And beside her, holding her hand with a grip that looked more possessive than affectionate, was Ron Weasley. The applause began, a thunderous, wet sound that made Draco's teeth ache. The Minister for Magic, Kingsley Shacklebolt, raised his hands for silence, his deep voice booming across the atrium. "It is a rare joy," Kingsley began, beaming at the couple, "to see history not only made, but honored. Tonight, we do not just celebrate the anniversary of our victory, but the union of two of its greatest architects. To Hermione Granger and Ron Weasley, on their engagement." The cheer that went up was deafening. Draco didn't move. He didn't clap. He took a slow, measured sip of the burning liquid in his glass, his grey eyes narrowing by a fraction of a millimeter. Engagement. The word tasted like ash. It wasn't shock he felt. He had known this was a statistical probability. The golden trio, the inseparable unit, the narrative that demanded a neat, tidy ending. The hero gets the girl. The sidekick gets the glory. The villain gets forgotten. But Draco wasn't looking at the narrative. He was looking at the data. And the data was flawed. He watched Hermione turn to Weasley. He watched the way Weasley leaned down and kissed her, a clumsy, enthusiastic collision of mouths that lacked any semblance of grace. He watched Hermione's shoulders stiffen, imperceptibly to anyone else, but glaringly obvious to Draco. She didn't lean into him. She endured him. She is making a mistake, Draco thought. The thought was calm, cold, and devoid of hysteria. It was simply a fact, like gravity or the boiling point of wolfsbane potion. She is confusing shared trauma with compatibility. He set his glass down on a passing floating tray. The noise was becoming unbearable. He needed air. More importantly, he needed to verify his hypothesis. The terrace overlooking Wizarding London was deserted. The rain lashed against the protective charms, blurring the lights of the Muggle city below into streaks of neon and grey. It was cold out here, the dampness seeping through the magic, but the silence was worth the chill. Draco leaned against the stone balustrade, lighting a cigarette with a snap of his fingers. The smoke curled grey against the black sky. 5 minutes later, the heavy oak doors creaked open. He didn't turn around. He knew the cadence of those footsteps. Quick, decisive, heavy on the heel. The walk of a woman who carried the weight of the world in her handbag. "I thought you'd be basking in the adoration," Draco said, his voice low, cutting through the sound of the wind. Hermione gasped, stopping abruptly. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, muting the party to a dull roar. "Malfoy, I didn't know anyone was out here." "Evidently." He turned then, slowly, leaning his elbows back against the stone railing. He looked her over with a clinical detachment that he knew unnerved her. "Hiding, Granger, at your own engagement party." "I am not hiding," she snapped, her posture straightening instantly. It was a reflex. Armor up. "I just needed a moment of quiet. It's loud in there." "It's catastrophic," he corrected. A sensory assault designed to mask the mediocrity of the wine. He took a drag of the cigarette, watching the embers glow. "Congratulations, by the way. I suppose it was inevitable." Hermione crossed her arms, the emerald silk of her dress rustling. She looked defensive, her jaw set tight. "Thank you, though I suspect you mean that as an insult." "Not an insult, an observation." Draco exhaled a plume of smoke, tilting his head. "You have a penchant for rescuing stray things. House elves, hippogriffs, Weasleys. It follows a pattern." "Ron is not a charity case," she hissed, stepping closer. Her eyes flashed with that familiar Gryffindor fire, the heat that usually made Draco retreat behind his walls. Tonight, it only made him curious. "He is a good man, a hero." "He is a symbol," Draco said softly. "And you are marrying a symbol because it's easier than finding a partner who actually challenges you." Hermione froze. The wind whipped a curl of hair across her face, but she didn't brush it away. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." Draco dropped the cigarette and vanished it with a wave of his hand. He pushed off the railing, walking towards her. He moved like a predator, fluid, silent. "Let's analyze the variables, shall we? You are the brightest witch of your age. You are currently rewriting the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's entire legislative framework. You read ancient runes for leisure." He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough to smell the rain on her skin. "And Weasley?" Draco continued, his voice devoid of mockery, smooth as polished glass. "He manages a joke shop. He hasn't opened a book since 1998, unless it had pictures. He interrupts you when you speak because he doesn't understand the end of your sentences. I've watched you, Granger, at meetings, at lunches. You shrink yourself to fit into the space he leaves for you." "You know nothing about us," Hermione said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You know nothing about love, Draco Malfoy. You think everything is a transaction, a calculation. Isn't it?" He raised an eyebrow. "Marriage is a contract, a merger of assets, intellects, and lineages. In your case, it's a merger of a supernova and a black hole. He will consume your light, Granger, not out of malice, but out of sheer dense gravity. He will bore you to death before you are 30. "Stop it." She took a step back, shaking her head. "You're jealous. That's what this is. You're bitter and alone, and you can't stand seeing anyone else happy." "Happy?" Draco laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Is that what you are?" You've been out here for 10 minutes, and you haven't smiled once. You look exhausted. You look like a woman who has resigned herself to a life of comfortable disappointment because she's too afraid to admit she outgrew her childhood friends. "I love him," she shouted, the words tearing out of her throat. "I didn't ask if you loved him," Draco replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I asked if you respected him, if he stimulates your mind, if he understands the darkest parts of you, the parts that aren't Golden Girl, but ruthless, ambitious, and terrifying. Does Ron Weasley know what you're capable of, or does he just like that you organize his life?" Hermione stared at him. Her chest was heaving. For a second, the mask slipped. He saw the panic in her eyes, the terrifying recognition of truth. It was there, flickering like a dying candle. She knew, somewhere deep down in the places she refused to look, she knew he was right. But she was Hermione Granger. She would burn the world down before she admitted defeat to Draco Malfoy. She stepped forward, invading his space, her finger jabbing into his chest. "You are poison, Malfoy. You twist everything until it looks ugly, just like you. Ron is kind. He's loyal. He stayed. You ran." The blow landed. Draco flinched imperceptibly, his eyes turning to ice. "Yes," he said, his voice flat. "I ran, and I learned the cost of bad decisions. I'm trying to save you from yours." "I don't need saving," she spat, turning on her heel. "Especially not from you. Stay away from me, Malfoy. Stay away from my life." "I can't do that," he said to her back. She paused at the door, her hand on the iron handle. "Why?" "Because tomorrow morning, the Ministry is announcing a complete audit of the Aura Office," Draco said, his tone shifting back to professional detachment. "I've been assigned as the senior auditor. Weasley's file is first on my desk." Hermione spun around, her face draining of colour. "What?" "I'm not going to ruin him, Granger," Draco said, buttoning his jacket, his face a mask of calm superiority. "I'm just going to check his work. If he's as competent as you say, you have nothing to worry about." He paused, letting the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating. "But we both know he isn't, don't we?" Hermione didn't answer. She stared at him with a mixture of hatred and fear, and for the first time that evening, Draco felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. He hadn't won the argument, not yet, but he had changed the equation. She ripped the door open and disappeared back into the warmth and the noise, fleeing the cold truth of the terrace. Draco stood alone in the rain. He looked at the spot where she had stood. He could still smell her perfume, lilac and old parchment, lingering in the damp air. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver coin, rolling it over his knuckles. "Let the audit begin," he whispered to the night. The darkness swallowed his words, but the tension remained, vibrating in the air like a plucked string, waiting to snap. The morning light filtering into Hermione Granger's office was not kind. It was a pale, antiseptic grey, the colour of a headache, stripping away the golden warmth of the previous night's gala and leaving only the stark reality of a Tuesday at the Ministry. Hermione sat behind her desk, a cooling cup of tea untouched near her elbow. The Daily Prophet lay spread out before her. The headlines screamed in moving bold print: Ministry, Crackdown, War Heroes or Bureaucratic Nightmares. Below it, a sub-headline announced the appointment of a special financial task force to review post-war departmental spending. The name Draco Malfoy was not in the headline, but his fingerprints were all over the article's precise, scathing tone. She pressed her palms against her eyes, the phantom's throb of a migraine pulsing behind her temples. She hadn't slept. The echo of Draco's words on the terrace had followed her home, slipping into her bedsheets, sitting heavy on her chest. He will consume your light. Rubbish, she whispered to the empty room. Absolute, bitter rubbish. She reached for her quill, determined to bury herself in the reassuring familiarity of the subplot regarding cauldron bottom thickness regulations. Work was safe. Work made sense. A sharp, rhythmic knock on her door shattered the quiet. Before she could say, "Come in," the handle turned. The door opened with a smooth, oiled silence that set her teeth on edge. Draco Malfoy stepped inside. He looked infuriatingly fresh. While Hermione felt like her skin was made of parchment and her eyes of grit, Draco looked as if he had been sculpted from marble that very morning. His suit was a charcoal grey, severe and expensive. He carried a leather satchel in one hand and a single, thick manila folder in the other. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how she was. He simply walked to the chair opposite her desk, pulled it out, and sat down with the fluid grace of a man who owned the building. "Granger," he acknowledged, his voice cool and clipped. "Malfoy," she replied, her voice tighter than she intended. She sat up straighter, instinctively smoothing the front of her robes. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I'm assuming you're here to gloat about your new title. High Inquisitor has a certain ring to it, doesn't it? Very nostalgic." Draco's expression didn't flicker. He placed the satchel on the floor and laid the single folder on the center of her desk. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was soft, yet it resonated like a gunshot in the small room. "Audit lead," he corrected calmly. "And I'm not here to gloat. I'm here for the preliminary review of the Aura Office's discretionary spending and case file management. As deputy head of the DMLE, your signature is on the oversight logs." Hermione stared at the folder. It was thick, disordered. Even from here, she could see edges of parchment sticking out at odd angles. "Weasley's file," Draco said, answering her unasked question. Hermione felt a flush of heat crawl up her neck. "This is ridiculous. It's been less than 12 hours since the announcement. You're targeting him." "I am targeting irregularities," Draco said, leaning back and crossing one leg over the other. His eyes were pale flint, unreadable and hard. The algorithm flagged his file at 6 a.m. I'm simply the messenger. "Algorithm?" Hermione scoffed. "Since when do we use—" "Since I updated the department's archaic filing system last night," he interrupted. "Efficiency, Granger. You of all people should appreciate it." He gestured to the folder with a long, pale finger. "Open it." "I know what Ron does," she said, refusing to touch it. "He catches dark wizards. He saves lives. He doesn't have time to color-code his expense reports like some obsessive accountant. Open it." The command was soft, but there was a weight to it that made Hermione's hand twitch. She glared at him, then snatched the folder, flipping it open aggressively. "Fine. Let's see what terrible crime he's committed. Did he buy the wrong quill ink? Did he?" Her voice trailed off. The first page wasn't an expense report. It was a mission log from 2 weeks ago. The raid on Nocturne Alley. She remembered it. Ron had come home with a cut on his cheek and a story about a thrilling duel. The report in front of her was sparse. Suspects apprehended. 3. Evidence seized. Various dark artifacts. Casualties. None. The handwriting was scrawled, barely legible. But what caught Hermione's eye were the annotations in red ink, Draco's ink, in the margins. Evidence chain broken. Artifacts 4, 7, and 9, unlogged for 48 hours. Witness statements. Missing. Damage to property, 400 galleons. Unexplained. He was tired, Hermione said quickly, flipping the page. It was a long raid. Turn to page 12, Draco said. She did. It was a request for reimbursement. Ron had claimed 50 galleons for informant payments. There were no receipts, no names, just a scribble that looked suspiciously like Weasley's Wizard Wheez's product development. Hermione's stomach gave a sickening lurch. She knew that handwriting. She knew that specific laziness. It wasn't malice. It was the comfort of a man who knew he was untouchable, who knew that Harry Potter was his best friend and Hermione Granger was his fiancée, and that nobody would dare question where the galleons went. He probably lost the receipts, she stammered, hating the way her voice sounded. Weak, apologetic. I can ask him to find them. You are not his secretary, Granger, Draco said. The temperature in the rooms seemed to drop. And you are not his mother. I am his partner. You are the deputy head of magical law enforcement, Draco countered, his voice rising just enough to cut through her defense. Your job is to uphold the law. His job is to enforce it. Looking at this file, neither of you is doing very well. Hermione slammed the folder shut. This is petty. You're cherry-picking mistakes to humiliate him because you can't stand that he's a hero and you're just a bureaucrat. Draco stood up. The movement was sudden, and for a second the air crackled with kinetic energy. He placed both hands on her desk, leaning down until they were eye level. The smell of him, clean linen, mint, and cold rain, washed over her. A hero, Draco repeated, the word tasting of bile. Let me tell you what I see, Granger. I don't see a hero. I see a liability. He tapped the cover of the folder. Broken chains of evidence mean dark wizards walk free on technicalities. Missing witness statements mean convictions don't stick. Unaccounted galleons mean corruption. You think this is about me hating Weasley? I don't care enough about him to hate him. He is irrelevant. He paused, his gaze boring into hers, stripping away her anger and leaving only naked vulnerability. I care that you are signing off on this trash. I care that the brightest witch of her age is compromising her own integrity to cover for a man who can't be bothered to cast a simple scourgify on his own mess. Hermione's breath hitched. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to hex him. But the logical part of her brain, the part she had been suppressing for years to keep the peace in her relationship, was screaming that he was right. She had fixed Ron's reports before, dozens of times. She had stayed late, rewriting his narratives, correcting his spelling, filling in the gaps he left behind. She told herself it was support. Draco was calling it what it was, enabling. It's a few mistakes, she whispered, her eyes burning. He's under pressure. We are all under pressure, Draco said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. But if I made these mistakes, I would be in Azkaban. If you made these mistakes, you would be fired. Why is he special? Because he caught a snitch once? Because he stood next to Potter? He pushed off the desk, straightening his suit. He looked at her with a mixture of disappointment and something else, something hot and frustrated that looked dangerously like desire, twisted into judgment. "I'm launching a formal inquiry, Granger. Not into the money, into the competence. He's going to be suspended pending review." "You can't," Hermione said, standing up. Panic flared in her chest. "The wedding, the press, it will destroy him." "Then maybe he should have done his job," Draco said simply. He picked up his satchel. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired. "I'm leaving the file with you. Read it, all of it. Don't correct it. Don't fix it with your magic marker. Just read it." He walked to the door. "Draco," she called out. It was the first time she had used his given name in years. He stopped, hand on the brass knob. He didn't turn around. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Really?" He stood there for a long moment. The silence stretched, filled with the scratching of quills from the outer office and the relentless drumming of the rain. "Because," he said, his voice barely audible, "I am tired of watching you pretend that mediocrity is enough for you." The door clicked shut. Hermione was left alone in the grey light. The folder sat on her desk, heavy and accusing. She stared at it. She knew she should throw it in the bin. She should burn it. She should go to Kingsley and demand Draco be removed from the case. That's what a loyal fiancé would do. But Hermione Granger was, above all things, a seeker of truth. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she reached out and opened the folder again. She began to read, and with every page she turned, the image of the man she was supposed to marry began to blur, replaced by a picture of a man who expected her to carry him, just as she had carried him through school, through the war, and now through life. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a cold, treacherous voice that sounded exactly like Draco Malfoy whispered, "Finally." The Department of Records, affectionately known as the Morgue by anyone unfortunate enough to work there, was located on the lowest accessible level of the ministry. It was a cavernous, subterranean labyrinth where the air was always 10 degrees colder than the floors above, smelling of decaying parchment, iron gall ink, and the dry, dusty scent of forgotten history. It was 9 p.m. on a Friday. Hermione Granger should have been at the Burrow. There was a dinner planned: Molly's roast chicken, Arthur's questions about plug sockets, and the noisy, chaotic warmth that usually acted as a balm to her frayed nerves. Instead, she was here, buried in the dark. She sat at a long, scarred oak table in aisle 42, surrounded by towering stacks of files. The only light came from a single hovering lantern that cast long, dancing shadows against the shelves. Hermione rubbed her temples, her eyes stinging. In front of her lay the Weasley Case History, 1999-2002. She had been here for 3 hours, desperately searching for context. She needed to prove that Draco's data was skewed. She needed to find the extenuating circumstances, the verbal authorizations that hadn't been written down, the heroic moments that didn't fit into neat little boxes on a spreadsheet. She picked up a report from 6 months ago. Subject: Surveillance of Borgin and Burks. Aura in charge: R. Weasley. The log stated the surveillance was terminated at 14 hours. The reason listed: suspect inactivity. But Hermione knew that day. She remembered it vividly because Ron had met her for a late lunch at the Leaky Cauldron at 14:15, laughing about how boring the alley was. 2 hours later, a dark artifact, a cursed necklace, had been moved out of the shop and sold to a collector in Bristol who was hospitalized a week later. You're looking for a ghost, Granger. The voice emerged from the darkness, smooth and low, startling her so badly she knocked her inkpot. With a reflex honed by war, she caught it before it spilled, her heart hammering against her ribs. Draco Malfoy stepped into the circle of light. He had shed his suit jacket. He was in his shirt sleeves, the white linen rolled up to his elbows, revealing the faint, faded scars of Sectum Sempra slicing across his forearm, and the dark mark, now just a silver scar, stark against his pale skin. He didn't hide it. He didn't flaunt it. It was just there, a fact of his anatomy. "I am not looking for ghosts," Hermione said, her voice sounding thin in the vast silence of the archives. "I am looking for the truth. Context matters, Malfoy. You can't judge fieldwork solely by paperwork." "Can't you?" Draco pulled out the chair opposite her, turning it around to straddle it, resting his arms on the backrest. He looked tired too. There were violet shadows under his eyes, but his gaze was as sharp as a scalpel. Paperwork is the skeleton of the law. If the bones are rotten, the body collapses. "Ron operates on instinct," she argued, closing the file in front of her as if to shield Ron from Draco's judgment. "He has an intuition that you can't document. He knows when to act and when to wait." "Is that what happened with the Borgin surveillance?" Draco nodded toward the file she had just closed. Intuition? Or was he hungry? Hermione stiffened. He assessed the threat level and deemed it low. "He left his post," Draco corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. "He abandoned a Class A surveillance target because he was bored. And because he knew that if anything went wrong, Harry Potter would bail him out, or Hermione Granger would find a legal loophole to justify his negligence." "Stop it," she whispered. "No." Draco leaned forward, intruding into her space. The lantern light flickered, casting his face in sharp relief. The high cheekbones, the straight nose, the mouth that never smiled anymore. "I won't stop. Because you need to hear this. You've been rewriting his reality for years. I've gone through the logs, Hermione. I've seen the edits. The handwriting changes halfway through reports. His spelling improves miraculously in the conclusions. That's your hand." He reached out, his fingers hovering over the stack of files, not touching them, but claiming them. "You are not his fiancée," Draco said softly. "You are his editor." Hermione stared at him, her mouth dry. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to throw him out. But the truth was a physical weight in her stomach. She did edit his reports. She did it late at night while Ron slept, telling herself she was just tidying up. She told herself it was partnership. "I help him," she said, her voice trembling. "That's what partners do. We support each other." "Support is holding someone up when they stumble," Draco said, his grey eyes locking onto hers. "It isn't carrying them so their feet never touch the ground. Look at you." His gaze dropped to her hands, which were stained with ink, then up to her face. "You are the deputy head of the DMLE. You are exhausted. You are hiding in a basement on a Friday night, trying to retroactively justify the incompetence of a man who is currently at home, likely eating dinner, wondering why you're late, but not caring enough to come find you." "He trusts me," Hermione defended weakly. "He takes you for granted," Draco countered. "There is a difference." He stood up then, the sudden movement stirring the stagnant air. He walked around the table, coming to stand behind her. Hermione didn't turn, but her entire body went rigid. She could feel the heat radiating from him. He was close. Too close. He reached over her shoulder, his arm brushing against her wild curls, and pulled a different file from the bottom of the stack. "Read this one," he murmured, his voice right by her ear. She shivered. It was involuntary, a reaction to the sudden proximity, the scent of expensive cologne and old dust, and the dangerous, magnetic pull of his intellect. She looked down at the file he had placed in front of her. It was a transcript of an interrogation. Ron Weasley questioning a suspect in a smuggling ring. Aura Weasley. "Where's the shipment?" Suspect. "I don't know what you're talking about." Aura Weasley. "Don't lie to me. I know you have it. Tell me or I'll..." Redacted. The redaction was thick and black. "He lost his temper," Draco said, his voice a low vibration against her back. "He threatened to plant evidence. The recording charm caught it. You didn't see this one because Shacklebolt buried it before it got to your desk, to protect the hero." Hermione read the lines again, the words blurred, threatening a suspect. It was a fireable offense. It was something a bully would do. "He wouldn't," she whispered. He was just scaring him. He was abusing his power because he didn't have the skill to outwit the suspect, Draco said. He stepped back, giving her space to breathe, though the air still felt thin. "Intellect, Granger. That is the currency of our world now. The war is over. We don't need Gryffindor bravery anymore. We need Slytherin precision. We need Ravenclaw logic. We need people who think before they cast." He walked back to his side of the table and began gathering his things. His movements were precise, controlled. He was a machine of efficiency, contrasting sharply with the chaotic sprawl of Hermione's emotional turmoil. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, her voice cracking. "If you have this evidence, why haven't you just published the report? Why drag me down here?" Draco paused, his hands resting on his leather folio. He looked at her across the barrier of the table, across the barrier of their blood status, their history, their houses. "Because," he said slowly, "I don't want to destroy him. I don't care about him, but I do object to the waste of potential." "What potential?" "Yours." The word landed softly, but it struck hard. "You are tethered to a sinking ship, Hermione," he said, using her first name again. It sounded strange on his tongue, formal yet intimate. "And you are so busy bailing out the water that you haven't noticed you're drowning. I'm showing you the water level." He picked up his jacket and slung it over his shoulder. "I'm going to finish the audit this weekend. I'll present the final findings on Monday. You have 2 days to decide if you want to be the woman who covers up the truth or the woman who demands it." He turned to leave, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. "Malfoy," she called out. He stopped in the shadows of the aisle. "Do you enjoy this?" she asked, tears stinging her eyes. "Being right?" He turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see the sharp profile of his face. "No," he said, and for the first time she heard a note of genuine weariness in his voice. "I find it incredibly lonely." Then he was gone. Hermione was left alone in the pool of lantern light. The silence of the archives rushed back in, deafening and absolute. She looked down at the redacted file, at the evidence of Ron's arrogance and her own blindness. She felt a crack in the foundation of her life. It wasn't a loud noise. It was the quiet, terrifying sound of a structural failure. She reached for her quill to close the file, to put it away, to go home to the burrow and pretend none of this had happened. But her hand hovered. She couldn't do it. She couldn't unsee the truth. Draco hadn't used magic to hurt her. He hadn't used insults. He had used facts. And in doing so, he had done something far more dangerous than any curse. He had made her respect him. And worse, he had made her question if she had ever truly respected the man she was about to marry. Hermione extinguished the lantern. The darkness was total. For a long time, she sat in the dark, listening to the beating of her own heart, realizing that for the first time in years, she didn't know the answer to the question, "What do I do next?" But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to the burrow. She had work to do, not for Ron, for herself. She lit her wand, the harsh white light cutting through the gloom. She pulled the stack of files closer. She wasn't going to edit them tonight. She was going to read them, every single one, and she was going to let them stand on their own. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement's reference library was a cathedral of silence. Rows of towering mahogany shelves stretched up into the gloom, laden with books that breathed under their leather bindings. It was the sort of silence that felt heavy, pressurized, as if the knowledge contained within the room was physically displacing the air. It was 11:45 p.m. on Sunday. The deadline for the audit was 9 hours away. Hermione Granger and Draco Malfoy sat at a sprawling table in the restricted section, an island of light in a sea of shadows. Between them lay the autopsy of a career, 7 years of Ron Weasley's professional life, dissected, catalogued, and cross-referenced. The atmosphere was brittle. For the last 2 days, they had worked in a rhythm that was terrifyingly efficient. No arguments, no insults, just the scratch of quills, the rustle of parchment, and the occasional clipped request for a citation. Hermione looked at the document in front of her. It was a summary of procedural violations. The list was long. It was undeniable, and for the first time in her life, she couldn't argue her way out of it. There was no counter-argument for laziness. There was no defense for apathy. She felt Draco's eyes on her. He wasn't reading. He was watching her read. "You've been staring at that paragraph for 12 minutes, Draco said. His voice was low, a velvet texture that scraped against her frayed nerves. "The ink is dry, Granger. The facts won't change just because you wish them to." Hermione looked up. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her hair a chaotic halo around her face. She felt exposed, stripped of the armor of righteousness she had worn for so long. "I'm not wishing," she said, her voice hoarse. "I'm thinking." "You're grieving," Draco corrected. He leaned back in his chair, his posture deceptively relaxed, though his fingers were tapping a silent, agitated rhythm against the armrest. "You are mourning the death of an illusion. It's a painful process. I'm told the first stage is denial. I believe we passed that on Tuesday." "This isn't a therapy session, Malfoy. Stick to the audit." "This is the audit," he countered smoothly. "We are auditing your judgment." Hermione slammed her quill down. The sound echoed sharply in the vast room. "My judgment is not on trial here." "Isn't it?" Draco's eyes narrowed, the grey darkening to the colour of a storm cloud. "Every signature on these reports is yours, Hermione. Every time you covered for him, every time you fixed his mess, you made a choice. You chose to value his comfort over the law. You chose to value his ego over the safety of the public." He stood up and walked around the table. He didn't come close enough to touch, but he occupied her space, his presence dominating the air. He was like a sleek, dangerous cat circling a cornered bird. "Why?" he asked. It wasn't a taunt. It was a genuine inquiry, delivered with the cold precision of a vivisectionist. "I need to understand the logic. I know you, Granger. You are obsessive about rules. You are ruthless about standards. You sent your own parents to Australia to save them. You are capable of impossible, hard choices. So, why him? Why does he get the pass?" Hermione stared at her hands. They were trembling slightly. "Because he was there," she whispered. "When the world was falling apart, he was there. You weren't. You don't get to judge the bond forged in war." "Ah," Draco said softly. "The war card, the ultimate trump." He took a step closer. "Loyalty. It's a noble quality. Hufflepuffs prize it. Dogs are famous for it. Don't you dare." "But loyalty without scrutiny isn't a virtue, Granger. It's just habit." Draco leaned down, placing his hands on the table, trapping her between his arms without actually touching her. The scent of him, clean, sharp, masculine, filled her senses. "You aren't loyal to him because he's a great man," Draco murmured, his voice dropping to a whisper that vibrated in her bones. "You're loyal to him because he's safe, because he's the baseline. He doesn't challenge you. He doesn't ask you to be more than you are. In fact, he prefers it when you're less. He's familiar, and you, for all your Gryffindor bravery, are terrified of the unknown." "You don't know what I'm terrified of," she breathed, looking up at him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "I think I do." His gaze dropped to her mouth, then back to her eyes. The look was intense, searing. It wasn't soft. It was a challenge. "You're terrified that if you actually demanded what you deserve, an equal, a partner, someone who could actually match your mind, you'd end up alone. So you settle for the boy who makes you feel necessary." "He loves me," she said, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. "He loves that you organize his life," Draco corrected brutally. "He loves that you are a trophy, the war heroine on his arm. Does he know you? Does he know what books you read when you can't sleep? Does he know that you hate the smell of peonies but pretend to like them because he buys them for you? Does he know that you're bored, Hermione? Bored to your very soul?" The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. The boredom, the crushing, suffocating boredom of a life where she always had to be the teacher, the mother, the manager. She had buried it under layers of busyness and duty. Draco had just excavated it with a few sentences. "You are cruel," she whispered, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. "I am honest," he said. "And right now, I am the only person in your life who respects you enough to tell you the truth to your face." The silence that followed was electric. The air between them crackled with tension, anger, grief, and something else. Something dangerous. Hermione looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. She saw a man who had rebuilt himself from the ruins of a villain, who had clawed his way back to respectability through sheer relentless competence. He was sharp edges and cold logic, but he was seeing her. He wasn't looking at the golden girl. He was looking at the woman who was falling apart, and he wasn't offering her a handkerchief. He was offering her a mirror. Without thinking, she reached out. Her hand moved across the parchment-strewn table. She wasn't sure what she was reaching for. Maybe the quill, maybe the ink, but her fingers brushed against his. The contact was shocking. It wasn't a spark. It was a jolt. A sudden, violent connection that seemed to arc through her entire nervous system. His skin was cool. Hers was fever hot. Draco froze. He looked down at their hands. Her fingers were resting lightly against his knuckles. It was a tiny point of contact, barely an inch of skin, but it felt like the loudest thing in the room. For a second, just one heartbeat, his mask slipped. Hermione saw a flash of raw, agonizing hunger in his eyes. It was a look of possession, a look that said, "I could burn the world for you, and I would do it correctly." The tension spiked, thick and suffocating. The air felt charged, as if a storm were about to break inside the library. If she moved her hand an inch, she would be holding his. If he leaned forward 3 inches, he would be kissing her. The possibility hung between them, terrifying and intoxicating. Then Draco pulled away. He didn't jerk his hand back. He withdrew it slowly, deliberately, as if he were unpeeling himself from a dangerous spell. The loss of contact left her skin tingling and cold. He straightened up, his face closing off like a shuttered window. The hunger vanished, replaced by the icy wall of the auditor. "Focus, Granger," he said, his voice devoid of the heat that had been there seconds ago. "We have section 12 to finish." He walked back to his side of the table and sat down. He didn't look at her. He picked up his quill and dipped it into the ink, his movements precise and mechanical. "Draco," she whispered, the name slipping out before she could stop it. He paused, the quill hovering over the parchment. He didn't look up. "Do not," he said, his voice sharp and warning. "Do not mistake this for a moment of weakness. We are here to do a job. You are engaged to another man, and I am not in the habit of taking things that are already broken." Hermione felt the sting of his rejection, but beneath it, she felt something else. A strange, twisted clarity. He wasn't rejecting her because he didn't want her. He was rejecting her because he wouldn't be a mistake. He wouldn't be the messy, emotional outlet for her confusion. He was demanding that if she ever came to him, she would come to him whole. She looked at the man across the table, the enemy, the auditor, the only person who made her feel alive. She picked up her own quill. Her hand was steady now. "Section 12, she said, her voice clear. "Misallocation of department resources." Draco nodded once, still not looking at her. "Proceed." They worked through the night. The physical distance between them was restored, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The audit was no longer about Ron Weasley. It was an autopsy of Hermione Granger's life choices. And as the sun began to bleed grey light through the high windows, Hermione realized with a sinking dread that the verdict was already in. She just hadn't signed the confession yet. Monday evening arrived wrapped in a shroud of relentless, drowning grey. London was weeping. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, turning the streets into slick black rivers, reflecting the fractured light of the city. Hermione Granger's flat in Hampstead was usually her sanctuary, a warm nest of books, soft throws, and the smell of steeping tea. Tonight, it felt like a waiting room. The air was stale. The silence was not peaceful. It was expectant. She sat on her sofa, her knees pulled to her chest, wrapped in a knitted blanket that Ron's mother had made for her 3 Christmases ago. It was orange and maroon, clashing violently with her neutral decor. She kept it because it was kind. She kept it because it was expected. On the coffee table, a half-packed box of wedding invitations sat open. Cream vellum, gold ink, the union of Ronald Bilious Weasley and Hermione Jean Granger. She stared at the names. They looked like strangers. The wards on her front door shimmered, a low, humming vibration that signaled a magical presence. Not Ron. Ron simply apparated into the living room with a crack that always made her jump. This visitor had knocked. Hermione unravelled herself from the blanket, her wand slipping instinctively into her hand. She walked to the door, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She knew who it was. She hadn't expected him to come here, to her private space, but the inevitability of it settled in her stomach like a stone. She opened the door. Draco Malfoy stood on her welcome mat. He was drenched. He held a black umbrella, but the wind had whipped the rain under it, plastering his blonde hair to his forehead and darkening the shoulders of his trench coat. He looked like a spectre of judgment washed up from the storm. "May I come in?" he asked. It wasn't a request for hospitality. It was a procedural inquiry. Hermione stepped back, holding the door open. "You've never been here." "I needed a secure environment," he said, stepping over the threshold. He collapsed the umbrella with a sharp snap and banished the water from his clothes with a flick of his wand. Steam rose from his coat, smelling of ozone and wet wool. "The ministry is porous. What I found today shouldn't be discussed where the portraits can hear." He didn't look around her flat. He didn't comment on the muggle layout or the sheer volume of books. His focus was entirely on her, his eyes scanning her face with that unnerving clinical precision. He saw the red eyes. He saw the exhaustion. He saw the box of invitations on the table. His gaze lingered on the box for a fraction of a second, a flicker of distaste, before snapping back to her. "Sit down, Granger." "This is my home, Malfoy. You don't give orders here." "I am giving you a recommendation," he corrected, reaching into his coat pocket. "Because you are going to want to be sitting for this." Hermione sat. She perched on the edge of the armchair, her spine rigid. Draco remained standing. He paced to the window, looking out at the rain-streaked darkness, his back to her. The tension in the room coiled tight, suffocating. "We finished the financial audit," he began, his voice directed at the glass. The numbers were sloppy, but explainable. Laziness isn't a crime. Incompetence is difficult to prosecute. He turned around. His face was pale, his expression carved from granite. "But then I cross-referenced the duty logs with the St. Mungo's admission records. I wanted to see if his administrative errors had consequences beyond the ledger." He walked to the coffee table and placed a single thin sheet of parchment on top of the wedding invitations. It covered their names. "Read it." Hermione looked at the parchment. It was a copy of an incident report from 6 months ago, the raid on the Knot Manor cellars. She remembered it. Ron had come home triumphant, boasting about clearing a nest of dark artifacts. She read the summary. Objective: secure and neutralize Class B dark objects in the subcellar. Lead Aura R. Weasley. Status: cleared. 14 hours. Then, below it, Draco had attached a St. Mungo's admission form dated the same day at 16:30 hours. Patient: Demelza Robbins, Junior Aura. Injury: severe necrosis of the right hand. Cause: contact with unneutralized rotting curse residue on a silver handle. Location of incident: Knot Manor, subcellar. Hermione's breath hitched. Demelza. She told me she had an accident during training. She lied, Draco said brutally, because Weasley asked her to. Hermione looked up, horror blooming in her chest. No, Ron wouldn't. He missed the handle, Draco said, his voice cold and steady. He did a visual sweep instead of a magical diagnostic because he wanted to clock out early. There was a Quidditch match. The Harpies were playing. He signed the clearance form without casting the counterspells. He took a step closer, looming over her. When Robbins touched the door 2 hours later, the curse ate through her protective glove in 3 seconds. Weasley didn't report it as a mission failure. He convinced a 22-year-old trainee to claim it was a training accident so he wouldn't face a disciplinary hearing. He traded her career and her health for his convenience. That's obstruction of justice, Hermione whispered. The room was spinning. This wasn't just laziness. This was malice born of selfishness. It was a fundamental lack of character. It is a crime, Draco said. It is grounds for immediate termination and potential prosecution. He watched her. He didn't look triumphant. There was no smirk, no sneer. He looked grim. It was the look of a man who had confirmed a diagnosis he hoped was wrong. Hermione stared at the parchment. The ink seemed to blur. She thought of Ron's smile. She thought of his laugh. She thought of the way he would shrug off mistakes, saying, "It all worked out in the end, didn't it?" But it hadn't worked out for Demelza Robbins. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why did you bring this here? Why not just file it?" "Because," Draco said, his voice dropping, losing some of its professional edge. "I needed you to see it before the world does. I needed you to understand that I am not destroying your life, Hermione. I am exposing the rot in the Foundation." He used her name again. It broke something inside her. Hermione stood up. She felt raw, flayed open. She looked at Draco, really looked at him. He was standing in her living room, a place of comfort, bringing her pain. But it was honest pain. It was clean. "You knew," she said quietly. "You knew he was like this." "I suspected," Draco replied. "People do not change their essential nature, Granger. He was a boy who copied my homework in potions because he couldn't be bothered to learn the ingredients. Now he is a man who copies safety protocols because he can't be bothered to cast the spells. The stakes just got higher." He looked exhausted. The mask of the uncaring aristocrat was slipping. Beneath it, Hermione saw a man who was desperately lonely in his own competence. A man who held himself to impossible standards and despised anyone who treated duty as a suggestion. She walked around the coffee table until she was standing in front of him. The air between them was heavy with the scent of rain and tragedy. "You're rigorous," she said softly. "You checked the medical records. No one else would have done that." "I am thorough," he said stiffly. "You're brilliant," she corrected. Draco flinched as if she had struck him. His grey eyes widened slightly, locking onto hers. "Don't," he warned. "Why not?" Hermione took a step closer. The anger at Ron was still there, burning hot, but overlaying it was a sudden, intense gravitation towards the man standing before her. "You are the only person who sees the world the way I do. Facts, consequences, truth." "I am the villain of your story, Granger," he murmured, but he didn't back away. "Are you?" She tilted her head, searching his face. "You came here tonight. You could have let me find out in the Prophet tomorrow. You could have humiliated me publicly. You didn't. You came to warn me." "I came to ensure you didn't attempt to cover it up," he lied. They both knew it was a lie. "You came because you wanted to be the one to tell me," she whispered. The distance between them vanished. Hermione didn't know who moved. Maybe it was gravity. She was standing close enough to feel the heat radiating from his damp clothes. She saw the pulse jumping in his throat. For a moment, the file on the table didn't matter. Ron didn't matter. There was only this, the sudden, terrifying recognition of an equal. Draco's hand twitched at his side. He wanted to touch her. She could feel it in the air, a phantom pressure against her skin. He wanted to reach out and brush the hair from her forehead, to wipe away the exhaustion. But he didn't. Draco Malfoy did not offer comfort. He offered clarity. He stiffened, his jaw tightening. He took a deliberate step back, re-establishing the boundary. The warmth that had flickered between them was extinguished instantly, replaced by the cold wall of his resolve. "The report will be filed at 8 a.m., he said, his voice devoid of the softness that had been there seconds ago. "Weasley will be suspended by noon. The investigation into the cover-up will likely last months." He looked down at the wedding invitations, then back at her. "You have a decision to make, Granger. Not about him. He is finished. About yourself. You can stand by him and claim ignorance, play the loyal martyr. The public will love it." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Or you can admit that you have been settling for a man who is unworthy of your intellect, your integrity, and your time." He turned to the door. "Draco," she said. He stopped, his hand on the latch. "Thank you," she said. It was barely a whisper. He didn't turn around. He simply nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. "Don't thank me yet. The truth is usually the thing that hurts the most." He opened the door and stepped back out into the storm. The wind howled, rushing into the warm flat, scattering the papers on the coffee table. Hermione stood alone in the center of her living room. The door clicked shut. She looked down at the table. The parchment with Demelza's injury report had landed on top of the invitation again. The Union. Slowly, methodically, Hermione reached down. She picked up the invitation. Cream vellum, gold ink, a promise of a future she had thought she wanted. She crushed it in her fist. The paper crumpled with a dry, crisp sound. She threw it into the unlit fireplace. She didn't cry. She felt strangely light, as if a heavy cloak had been lifted from her shoulders. The grief would come later, she knew. But right now, in the silence Draco Malfoy had left behind, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt awake. She picked up her wand and the file. She had work to do. She had to draft a statement, not for Ron, for the department. And for the first time, she wasn't going to ask Ron for his opinion. She was going to look at the facts, just the facts. The following morning, the Ministry of Magic felt less like a government building and more like a mausoleum. The silence on level 2 was absolute, the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that precedes a detonation. Hermione Granger walked down the corridor toward the auditor's office. Her heels clicked against the black marble floor, a sharp, staccato rhythm that echoed like gunfire. She was pale, her face drawn tight, but her eyes were dry. She had not slept. The image of the burning wedding invitation was still seared into her retinas, a ghost of ash and gold. She reached the heavy oak door with the simple brass plaque, D. Malfoy, Senior Auditor. She didn't knock. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Draco's office was an assault of minimalism. It was vast, cold, and terrifyingly orderly. The walls were lined with grey filing cabinets. The windows were enchanted to show a bleak, overcast seascape, grey waves crashing against black rocks, over and over again. There were no personal photos, no warmth, just a large, dark desk and Draco Malfoy sitting behind it. He was writing. He didn't look up when she entered. He finished his sentence, dotted the parchment with precise deliberation, and placed his quill in its stand. "You're early," he said, his voice flat. "The suspension notice doesn't go public until noon. I want you to withdraw the recommendation for a public tribunal," Hermione said. Her voice was steady, but it cost her. Draco looked up then. His face was a mask of bored indifference, but his eyes were alert, tracking her every micro-expression. "Negotiating, Granger. I thought we passed that stage when you burned your invitation." Hermione flinched. How did he know? She hadn't told anyone. But then, Draco Malfoy dealt in probabilities. He knew the variables. He knew the outcome. "I am not negotiating the findings," she said, walking up to the desk. She placed her hands on the cold wood, leaning forward. "The evidence is undeniable. Ron committed a crime. I accept that. But," Draco prompted, leaning back in his chair, his fingers steepling. "But a public tribunal will destroy him completely," she said, the words tasting like copper in her mouth. "He will be a pariah. His family, the Weasleys, don't deserve this humiliation. Let him resign. Let him leave quietly. Seal the specific details of the Robbins case." Draco stared at her. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the crashing waves from the enchanted window. "No," he said simply. "Draco, please. This isn't about justice anymore. It's about cruelty." "It is entirely about justice," he countered, his voice sharpening. He stood up, the movement fluid and menacing. "You want mercy. Mercy is subjective. Mercy is what allowed him to get away with mediocrity for 7 years because he was a good bloke. Mercy is why Demelza Robbins will never hold a wand properly with her right hand again. He didn't mean to hurt her. Intent is irrelevant to the necrotic tissue." Draco slammed his hand on the desk, the sound startling her. "Stop defending him. Stop trying to soften the blow. Why are you doing this? Guilty conscience?" "Because I loved him," she shouted, the confession tearing out of her. "Past tense," Draco noted instantly. "You loved him, and now you pity him. And you are terrified that if he is destroyed publicly, everyone will look at you, the woman who stood beside him for a decade, and wonder how you could have been so blind." He walked around the desk, closing the distance between them. The air in the room seemed to thin, making it hard to breathe. "This isn't about protecting Ron," Draco hissed, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "This is about protecting your own ego. You don't want the world to know that Hermione Granger, the smartest witch of her age, bet her future on a fraud." "That's not true," she stammered, stepping back. Her back hit the wall. There was nowhere left to retreat. Draco followed her. He stopped inches away, invading her personal space with a ruthlessness that made her skin prickle. He was close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his irises, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "Isn't it?" he challenged. "Look at me and tell me I'm wrong. You aren't here to save him. You're here because you feel guilty. And do you know why you feel guilty, Hermione?" She shook her head, unable to speak. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Because you are relieved, Draco said. The word hung in the air, heavy and damning. Hermione gasped. I am not. You are. He cut her off, relentless. You are relieved that I am the one holding the axe. You didn't have the courage to leave him. You didn't have the courage to tell him he wasn't enough for you. You waited. You waited for someone else to do the dirty work. He placed a hand on the wall beside her head, trapping her. He didn't touch her, but he was surrounding her, his presence overwhelming. I am your escape hatch, he whispered, his face inches from hers. You let me investigate him. You let me find the dirt. You let me destroy his career so you wouldn't have to break his heart over a cup of tea. You used me, Granger. You used my reputation as a cold-hearted bastard to free yourself. Hermione stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. She wanted to slap him. She wanted to scream. But the horror blooming in her chest was the horror of recognition. He was right. Deep down, beneath the anger and the grief, there was a tiny, treacherous spark of liberation. She was free, and she hadn't had to say the words. Draco had done it for her. I hate you, she breathed, tears finally spilling over. I hate you for saying that. Good, Draco said, his expression unyielding. Hate me. I don't need your gratitude. I don't need your affection. I just need you to be honest. You enjoy this, she accused, her voice shaking. You enjoy tearing people apart. I enjoy the truth, Draco roared, his control finally snapping. He pushed off the wall, pacing away from her, running a hand through his hair. He looked agitated, unraveling. Do you think this is easy for me? He demanded, spinning back to face her. Do you think I enjoy being the villain, the pariah? I do this because no one else will. Everyone else is too busy worshipping the ground the golden trio walks on to notice that the foundation is rotten. He pointed a finger at her, his hand trembling slightly. I am saving the department. I am saving future auras from getting their hands rotted off. And yes, in the process, I am saving you from a life of suffocating mediocrity. And you hate me for it, because it means you have to admit that you were wrong. Hermione wiped her tears with the back of her hand. She felt raw, exposed. The dynamic had shifted. This wasn't professional anymore. It wasn't about the audit. It was about them. You think you know everything, she said, her voice stronger now, fueled by a sudden hot anger. You analyze everything like it's a potion, but you don't understand people. You don't understand that kindness matters. Kindness is a luxury for people who aren't responsible for lives, Draco retorted. I am not kind, Granger. I am competent. Choose which one you want in a partner. The silence that followed was deafening. Choose which one you want in a partner. The implication hung between them, vibrating like a plucked string. Draco looked like he wanted to take the words back, his jaw tightening, his eyes flashing with a sudden vulnerability. Hermione looked at him. She saw the man who had stood in the rain for her, the man who had read through 7 years of files, the man who was willing to be hated by the entire wizarding world just to prove a point to her. You're cruel, she whispered. I am necessary, he replied. He walked back to his desk and picked up a quill. The mask was back in place, though it looked brittle now. The tribunal is scheduled for Friday. The suspension is effective immediately. Go back to your office, Granger. Write your press release. Play the grieving fiancé. I'll handle the rest. He didn't look at her. He was dismissing her, but Hermione didn't move. She stood there, feeling the aftershocks of the confrontation. She felt a strange, terrifying pull. The repulsion was there. He was arrogant, cold, and brutal. But beneath it was a magnetic attraction that frightened her more than his anger. He saw her. He understood the darkest, most selfish parts of her, and he didn't look away. He called them out. She realized then that the conflict between them wasn't ending. It was mutating. The barrier of Ron was gone. Now, there was nothing standing between Draco Malfoy's ice and her own fire, except the lies they were still telling themselves. "I'm not going to play the grieving fiancé," she said quietly. Draco's hand paused over the parchment. "I'm going to tell the truth," she said. "I'm going to support the tribunal." Draco looked up. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Respect, or perhaps fear. "Careful, Granger," he murmured. "The truth has consequences. Once you start telling it, you can't stop." "I know," she said. She turned and walked to the door. Her legs felt weak, but her head was high. "Hermione," he said. She stopped, her hand on the handle. It was the second time he had used her name. "It wasn't a mistake," he said, his voice low and intense. She turned her head slightly. "What wasn't?" "Stopping you on the terrace, ruining your engagement." He paused. "I would do it again." Hermione looked at the grey profile of the man who had systematically dismantled her life. She should hate him. She should curse him. "I know," she whispered. She opened the door and walked out. As the heavy oak clicked shut behind her, she leaned against the wall of the corridor, closing her eyes. Her pulse was racing. Her skin felt hot. She wasn't thinking about Ron. She wasn't thinking about the scandal. She was thinking about the way Draco Malfoy had looked at her when he said, "Choose which one you want." And she was terrified because for the first time she knew the answer. The Ministry atrium was a tomb of polished obsidian and silence. It was 2 a.m. on the night the tribunal's verdict had been leaked. The headlines were already being typeset in the bowels of the Daily Prophet. Weasley suspended. Golden Trio fractured. Granger silent. Hermione Granger wasn't silent. Inside her head, the noise was deafening. She stood outside the heavy oak door of the senior auditor's office. She had been standing there for 5 minutes, her hand hovering over the brass handle. Her reflection in the dark wood looked like a stranger. Eyes wide and dark, skin pale, lips pressed into a thin line of volatile energy. She looked like a woman who had just burned her life down and was looking for the arsonist who handed her the match. She pushed the door open. Draco Malfoy was there. Of course he was. He was standing by the enchanted window, which now displayed a pitch-black ocean under a starless sky. He held a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He didn't turn around. "The verdict is out," Hermione said. Her voice was brittle, scraping against the silence. "Indefinite suspension, mandatory retraining, a public inquiry into departmental nepotism." "I know," Draco replied, his back still to her. "I signed the order an hour ago. You destroyed him. I corrected him." Draco turned then. The low light of the office lamps cast deep shadows across his face, sharpening his features into something predatory and exhausted. He looked like a man who had won a war, but lost his soul in the process. "And you?" he added, his eyes scanning her disheveled appearance. "You look like you've been through a siege." "I have," she snapped, stepping further into the room and letting the door slam shut behind her. The sound was a gunshot in the quiet. Harry won't speak to me. Molly sent back my jumper. The press is camping on my doorstep, calling me the Ice Queen for testifying against my own fiancé. I am alone, Malfoy. Completely and utterly alone. You were alone before, Draco said, taking a slow sip of his drink. You just had noise to distract you. Now you have silence. It's louder, isn't it? Don't psychoanalyze me, Hermione shouted, the control she had maintained for days finally shattering. She stormed toward him, closing the distance to his desk. This isn't a game. These are people's lives. You treat us all like variables in an equation to be balanced. Do you feel anything? Or is this just another successful audit for you? Draco set the glass down on his desk with a deliberate clack. I feel plenty, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low timbre. I feel the weight of this department. I feel the resentment of every person in this building who hates me for my last name. And I feel the exhaustion of watching you pretend that you are a victim. I am a victim of your arrogance. You are a victim of your own cowardice, Draco roared back, matching her volume. The sudden explosion of emotion from him was terrifying. He rounded the desk, moving with a chaotic energy that he usually kept tightly leashed. You knew, he yelled, pointing a finger at her chest. You knew he was incompetent. You knew he was lazy. You knew he was bleeding you dry, taking your brilliance and using it as a crutch. But you stayed. You stayed because it was safe. You stayed because you were afraid to be the cold one, the ambitious one. Well, congratulations, Granger. You're finally her. You're finally the witch you were meant to be. I hate you, she hissed, tears of rage springing to her eyes. She shoved him. It was a physical, violent shove against his chest. Draco stumbled back a step, but he didn't retreat. He caught her wrists as she went to shove him again. His grip was iron hard, bruising. Hate me, he spat, his face inches from hers. Hate me all you want. But don't you dare stand there and tell me you wish you were still in that house, knitting socks for a man who didn't know your middle name. He knew me, she screamed, struggling against his grip. He loved me. He loved the idea of you. Draco shook her, just once, hard. I see you. I see the ugly parts. I see the ruthlessness you hide under that Gryffindor scarf. I see the arrogance that matches mine. I see the woman who would burn a marriage invitation rather than live a lie. That is who you are, and that is why you are here at 2 a.m. in my office instead of crying into a pillow. I am here to tell you to go to hell. You are here because I am the only person left who speaks your language. The air between them was so charged it felt toxic. They were chest to chest, breathing the same recycled air, their anger tangling together until it was impossible to tell where hers ended and his began. Hermione looked up at him. She saw the grey eyes, blown wide with adrenaline. She saw the sneer that was trembling at the corners. She saw a man who had stripped her bare, layer by layer, until there was nothing left but raw nerve endings. And in that moment, the hate transmuted. It didn't disappear. It just changed shape. It became hunger, a dark, desperate need to silence him, to consume him, to crash against him until the world stopped making sense. You are unbearable, she whispered, her voice trembling with fury. And you are free, he countered. Hermione yanked her hands free from his grip, but instead of pulling away, she grabbed the lapels of his expensive robes and yanked him down. Draco didn't resist. He crashed into her. His mouth found hers not with tenderness, but with violence. It was a collision, a searing, bruising impact of teeth and lips. There was no romance in it, no soft sighs. It was a kiss of frustration, of released pressure, of two tectonic plates finally slipping and causing an earthquake. Draco groaned, a low, guttural sound in his throat, and his hands tangled in her hair, gripping tight, pulling her head back to deepen the kiss. He kissed her like he wanted to devour her. He kissed her like he was angry at her for making him want this. Hermione responded with equal ferocity. She opened her mouth to him, tasting the whiskey and the bitterness on his tongue. She pressed her body against his, needing the solid, hard reality of him to ground her. She dug her nails into his shoulders, anchoring herself in the storm. This was the release. This was the explosion they had been building toward since that first night on the terrace. It wasn't love. It was inevitable. It was the physical manifestation of their intellectual war. Draco spun her around, slamming her back against the edge of his heavy desk. The impact knocked the breath out of her, but she didn't care. She wrapped her legs around him, pulling him closer, erasing every inch of space between them. Papers slid off the desk, fluttering to the floor like white feathers, ignored. "You are infuriating," Draco gasped against her mouth, biting her lower lip. "Shut up," she panted, dragging his head back down. His hands were everywhere, on her waist, her hips, her neck, possessive and demanding. He wasn't asking for permission. He was claiming territory he had already conquered intellectually. And Hermione, the strategist, the controller, the leader, she let go. She let him take the lead. She let herself drown in the sheer, overwhelming competence of his touch. For the first time in years, she wasn't carrying anyone. She was being met, force for force, mind for mind, darkness for darkness. The kiss went on, fueled by oxygen and rage. It was a purge. They were pouring all their guilt, their fear, their resentment into each other, burning it away in the friction of their bodies. Draco pulled back suddenly, gasping for air, his forehead resting against hers. His eyes were closed, his lashes fluttering against his pale cheeks. His chest heaved against hers. "Tell me to stop," he rasped, his voice wrecked. "Tell me to stop, Granger, and I will. But if you don't..." He opened his eyes. The grey was almost black. "If you don't, I am going to ruin you for anyone else. Because once you admit this, once you admit that you want this darkness, you can't go back to the light." Hermione looked at him. Her lips were swollen, her hair a disaster, her heart racing so fast it felt like a hummingbird trapped in her ribs. She looked at the man who had destroyed her engagement, humiliated her fiancé, and isolated her from her friends. She thought of Ron's clumsy fumbling. She thought of the gentle, boring safety of the burrow. Then she felt the steel of Draco's arms around her, the dangerous, intoxicating challenge in his eyes. "Don't you dare stop," she whispered. Draco let out a ragged breath, a sound that was half laugh, half curse. He kissed her again, harder this time, lifting her onto the desk completely, stepping between her knees. The storm outside the window had nothing on the one inside the room. This was the breaking point, the moment where the intellectual game ended and the physical reality began. And in the heat of it, amidst the scattered files and the scent of ozone and whiskey, Hermione Granger finally understood the truth Draco had been trying to teach her. She didn't want a hero. She didn't want to be saved. She wanted to be known, even if it meant being known by the monster. The rest of the night was a blur of skin and silence, and the desperate, clawing need to feel alive. They didn't speak. There were no words left to say. There was only the friction, the sweat, and the terrifying clarity of two people who had finally stopped lying to themselves. When it was over, the silence that returned to the room was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy with a new, complicated truth. Draco stood by the window again, fixing his shirt. Hermione sat on the edge of the desk, her legs dangling, watching him. They were ruined, both of them, and neither of them had ever felt more powerful. The dawn did not break. It merely leaked into the sky, a bruised purple bleeding into slate grey. The storm had finally passed, leaving London scoured clean and stripped of all warmth. Hermione Granger sat at her desk in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. It was 7 a.m. The building was empty, save for the cleaning charms sweeping the corridors and the low hum of the ventilation wards. Her hands rested on the cool mahogany surface. They were bare. The ring was gone. It wasn't in a box. It wasn't thrown in a fit of passion. It sat in an envelope in the outgoing owl tray, addressed to the borough. There was no letter accompanying it. Explanations were for people who expected forgiveness, and Hermione Granger was no longer in the business of asking for things she didn't need. In front of her lay the final document, Audit Report 492B, Structural Deficiencies in Aura Protocol. It had been released 30 minutes ago. Draco Malfoy had not hesitated. There had been no morning after hesitation, no softening of the blow because of what had transpired on his desk a few hours prior. He had woken up, buttoned his shirt, tied his tie with the same surgical precision he applied to everything, and he had pressed the button. Hermione ran her finger down the list of findings. Result: suspension of Senior Aura R. Weasley, indefinite. Reason: gross negligence, falsification of records, endangerment of personnel. Recommendation: full restructuring of command chain. It was a massacre. It was the end of an era. The Golden Trio was officially broken, not by dark wizards, but by paperwork, by facts. She felt a phantom sensation on her lips. The bruise of Draco's kiss, the lingering taste of whiskey and aggression. It felt like a brand. It marked the moment she had crossed the line from good to real. The door to her office opened. Hermione didn't jump. She didn't look up with hope or dread. She simply raised her eyes. Draco stood in the doorway. He looked immaculate. The dark circles under his eyes were the only evidence of the night before, but his robes were crisp, his hair severe. He held a takeaway cup of black coffee in one hand and a file in the other. He didn't come in. He leaned against the doorframe, regarding her with that same terrifying clinical detachment. "It's done," he said. "I saw," Hermione replied. Her voice was steady. It surprised her how steady it was. "The Prophet is already printing the special edition, The Fall of the Brave. They're calling you a vindictive bureaucrat." "I've been called worse by better people," Draco said, taking a sip of his coffee. "And what are they calling you?" "Nothing yet," she said. "They don't know what to call a woman who let it happen." "Collaborator," Draco suggested, the word sharp as a knife. "Perhaps." He walked into the room then, the spell of the doorway broken. He didn't come to her side of the desk. He didn't offer a touch or a comforting look. He walked to the visitor's chair, The same chair where he had sat a week ago and started this demolition, and sat down. He placed the file he was holding on the desk. "Your transfer papers," he said. Hermione blinked, looking at the folder. "What?" "You can't stay in the DMLE," Draco said, his tone conversational as if discussing the weather. "Not as deputy head. The resentment will be suffocating. Every time you discipline an aura, they'll whisper that you sold out your fiancé to save your own career. You'll be ineffective." Hermione felt a flash of the old anger, but it was dull, distant. "So you're firing me too? Is that the final move in your game?" "I'm promoting you," Draco corrected. He gestured to the papers. "Department of Mysteries, Senior Analyst, Unspeakable Level. It's a solo position, high clearance, no subordinates to manage, just pure research, just the work." Hermione stared at him. It was the job she had secretly wanted for 5 years. The job she had turned down because Ron had said the hours were too long, that the department was creepy, that they would never see each other. "Why?" she asked. Draco looked at her. For a second, the mask slipped, revealing the raw, jagged things underneath, the connection they had forged in the dark. "Because you are wasted here," he said quietly, "and because I don't want to have to audit you again." Hermione reached out and touched the transfer papers. They felt heavy. They felt like a life raft. "You planned this," she whispered. "From the beginning, the audit, the exposure, this." "I analyzed the variables," Draco said. "I saw a problem. I fixed it. And us." The question hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. "Last night, was that a variable, or was that a fix?" Draco went still. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the memory of skin against skin, the desperate, clawing need that had consumed them. He stood up slowly. He walked to the edge of the desk, towering over her seated form. He looked down at her, his grey eyes stripping away every defense she had left. "It was an anomaly," he said. The word was a slap in the face, cold, dismissive. "An anomaly," she repeated, her voice dead. "But," Draco continued, his voice dropping, rougher now, "it was the only data point that mattered." He reached out. For the first time that morning, he touched her. He placed his hand on the back of her neck, his thumb resting against her pulse point. His hand was cold, his grip firm. It wasn't a caress. It was a claim. "I am not going to ask you to dinner, Granger," he murmured, his thumb stroking the rhythm of her heartbeat. "I am not going to bring you flowers. I am not going to hold your hand at parties and pretend we are a fairy tale." He leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could smell the coffee and the mint, and underneath it, the scent of him, the scent of the storm. "I am difficult," he said. "I am selfish, and I am right, always." "I know," Hermione whispered, leaning imperceptibly into his touch. "And you," he went on, his eyes searching hers. "You are ruthless, you are brilliant, and you are tired of pretending you aren't." He brushed his thumb over her jawline, a gesture that was shockingly intimate in its restraint. "We aren't going to be happy, Hermione," he said, using her name like a weapon. "Happiness is for people who don't know any better. We're going to be clear. Clear." The word settled in her chest, displacing the guilt, displacing the fear. It felt like cold water. It felt like oxygen. She looked at the man who had ruined her life. She looked at the ringless hand on her desk. She thought about the chaos waiting for her outside this door, the weeping Weasleys, the furious press, the shattered reputation. She should be devastated. She should be crying. But she wasn't. She felt sharp. She felt honed. She reached up and covered his hand with hers. She didn't pull it away. She pressed it harder against her skin, accepting the weight of him. "I don't want happy," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I want the truth." Draco stared at her for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth quirked up. It wasn't a smile. It was a recognition. It was the look of a scientist who had finally proven a complex, dangerous theory. "Good," he said. He pulled his hand away, breaking the contact. The loss of warmth was immediate, but the connection remained. A taut, invisible wire stretched between them. "Sign the papers," he said, buttoning his jacket. "The position starts Monday." He turned and walked to the door. "Malfoy," she called out. He paused, hand on the handle. He looked back over his shoulder. "Was it worth it?" she asked. "Being the villain?" Draco looked at her, really looked at her, one last time. He looked at the woman sitting amidst the wreckage of her past, holding the keys to her future. He saw the fire in her eyes, unmasked and burning brighter than he had ever seen it. He didn't blink. "Every galleon," he said. He opened the door and stepped out into the bustling corridor. The noise of the ministry rushed in, shouts, footsteps, ringing telephones. The world was waking up to the scandal. Hermione sat alone in her office. She picked up her quill. She didn't look at the empty spot where the photo of Ron used to be. She looked at the transfer papers. Department of Mysteries. Name, Hermione Granger. She dipped the quill in the ink. The black liquid glistened like obsidian. She signed her name. The stroke was bold, sharp, and decisive. She set the quill down and exhaled. It wasn't a sigh of sadness. It was the breath of a diver coming up for air after being underwater for too long. She stood up, smoothed her skirt, and walked to the window. The grey sky outside was vast and indifferent. It didn't care about love. It didn't care about heroes. It just was. And for the first time in her life, Hermione Granger didn't need to change it. She just had to survive it. She turned back to the room, grabbed the file, and walked out the door. She didn't look back. The anatomy of the mistake was complete. The dissection was over. Now, finally, the life could begin.
Hi everyone, thank you for listening to the Anatomy of Mistake. This story is different. It is not sweet, it is not soft. I did not want to write a fairy tale, I wanted to write the truth. In this story, Draco is not a hero. He is cold, he is hard. But he sees Hermione. He sees who she really is. Sometimes love is not about kindness. Sometimes love is about being honest even when it hurts. Drago ruined Hermione's plans. He ruined her wedding, but he saved her from a lie, a sin that is romantic. It is a dark romance, but is real. They do not have a happy ending, they have a clear ending, and in their world, clarity is more important than comfort. I hope you felt the tension, I hope you felt the rain and the anger. Tell me in the comments, did Drago do the right thing, or was he too cruel? Thank you for being here with me. See you in the next story.